somebody, especially so young and with so much potential, it was a shocking crime.
A young life cut short when the body of an aspiring model is found bound and gagged inside the refrigerator of her Los Angeles apartment. For months, the case went without any arrests until now.
I could see this going to trial because of the seriousness and quite frankly, the gruesomeness of the crime.
The last time anyone saw 31-year-old Maleesa Mooney was September 6, 2023, when her apartment's surveillance system caught her on camera. She was headed up the elevator alongside a man and a woman. When days went by without any contact from Mooney, her family called police asking for a welfare check. That's when they stumbled upon a gruesome scene. Mooney's dead body was discovered inside her fridge, beaten and bound, showing signs of asphyxiation. According to court documents, investigators found her blood pooling beneath the fridge. The medical examiner ruled the manner of death as homicide, and for months, that's all we knew about the case. Cut to this month, when suspected killer 41-year-old Mangus Daniel Humphrey is arrested in the case, some 2,000 miles away from the crime scene in Minnesota. We sat down with attorney and legal analyst Dina Saig-Dahl to make sense of the case so far. And it happened way back in September, so 6-ish months ago. Why would it have taken so long to track down a suspect?
It's a really good question, because I think that they did probably find maybe either fingerprints or surveillance footage that helped them lead to the suspect. But the fact that it took so long, for one, this was such a gruesome crime. I don't think the police wanted there to be any mistakes in their investigation by the time they actually brought charges against who they think killed it. And I think it was probably more of that, making sure that they not only had the right person, that they had all the people that were involved. Because of the unusual nature of this crime, it wasn't very apparent why she was killed. It wasn't like it was obvious that it was a robbery or for some other reason. So I could see them having wanted to kind of make sure that there wasn't some unknown motive out there that they didn't know about it. And perhaps maybe they did discover, for all we know, more to be revealed on that end when this goes to trial.
Saig-Dahl says it's possible that prosecutors have a motive in Mooney's murder, but haven't yet revealed it.
Absolutely. Either A, they found out a motive, and maybe that's what took them so long, is kind of tracking that down. Or you have this really unusual situation where a killing is so gruesome. I mean, you tend to see gruesome crimes, either one, when the person knows somebody, right? So it's like a crime of passion, or two, if there's some sort of serial killer involved, where this is just how they kill their victims. And we cannot tell from what we know of the suspect so far. It doesn't seem like there's evidence for either case. But if this does go to trial, then we'll find out. Maybe they did find evidence that either he knew her, maybe he was even some sort of stalker. I mean, we'll see. It'll be interesting to see if they can connect him to her in any way.
So far, there's not much known about Humphrey, except that he pleaded not guilty to charges of murder and torture at an arraignment on Thursday. This after he was arrested in Minnesota and extradited back to Los Angeles. When he was taken into custody for Mooney's murder, there was already a federal arrest warrant out for him. It was issued in July 2023 when he failed to show up for a court hearing. He was on probation for a 2017 conviction for distributing heroin. He's all the way over in Minnesota, several time zones away from what happened, and now is back in LA. Should he have stayed in Minnesota? Should he fought it? What do you think about all that?
It's a really interesting case because he was already in the system, let's say in Minnesota. There was actually an arrest warrant for him 2 months before he allegedly committed this murder. So they would have had things like his fingerprints on file. And so the fact that they were able to track him down to Minnesota is not as surprising, let's say, as if somebody who was never in the criminal justice system. It would have been much harder to find somebody so many states away. But in this case, because he had this record, he was in this system, that made it that much easier for the police to then be able to track him down, assuming that is how they tracked him down, were things like the surveillance and the fingerprints. But in terms of him fighting the extradition, I don't think he would have won, even if he had tried to fight it. So, clearly California has a right to be able to prosecute him for a crime that was committed within their jurisdiction. And he sounds like he still has, like a violation of probation and other things to deal with in Minnesota. So I don't know if his situation was that much better anyway if he had tried to fight it and lost there.
According to the Los Angeles District Attorney, Humphrey had been staying at Mooney's apartment at the time of her murder, but we still don't know what their connection is. Most of what we do know comes from the extensive autopsy report released before Humphrey's arrest, detailing his alleged crime. A medical examiner noted Mooney suffered blunt force trauma to multiple areas of her body, including head, neck, torso, and her extremities. It was September 12th when Mooney's mother called requesting a welfare check. After officers entered her apartment, they, quote, found Ms. Mooney's body wedged inside the refrigerator with pooled blood beneath it. Her wrists were bound together, her ankles were bound together, and these bindings were tied to each other behind her back with miscellaneous electronic cords and clothing items. The report also states other clothing was found around Mooney's face and neck, including a gag stuffed inside her mouth. Based on what you read and the research that you've done on this case, do you believe that she was alive when she was put into the refrigerator?
Let's hope not. That would be a horrible situation. I mean, that's the thing, is this is a really awful way for her to have died. I mean, really awful. She tried to defend herself and she couldn't, and to be bound. And I mean, it's every woman's worst nightmare. And whether or not she was slowly dying before the refrigerator had already died, so awful either way.
How important is it going to be to determine the exact time of death, the exact time of the murder? Because we know we saw her on that last day, September 6th, but then she wasn't found dead until 6 days later on September 12th.
The timeline is going to be very important. And if for them to prove that that is the person who killed her, right, coming up the elevator, if it was 2 days before she died, then it's very easy for the person to argue that he was going up for some other reason. So it's that timeline. The expert, the medical examiner who will testify on the stand as to when she died, it will be very important in a situation like this. We do know a little bit based on the sister and saying that when she stopped communicating with them, that also helps the timeline. But that time of death that the expert will testify to will be crucial.
The autopsy doesn't make note of Mooney's time of death or her official cause of death. While manner of death is listed as homicide, it's not totally clear how she was killed. The ME wrote, quote, there is suspicion for homicidal asphyxia in this case, but without findings to elucidate a clear mechanism of death or knowledge of the sequence of events leading to Ms. Mooney's death, the cause of death is deemed homicidal violence. It was listed as manner of death, homicide, but there was no 100% cause of death. They said potentially strangulation, but it couldn't be officially determined. Is that something that could affect a jury, sway them one way or another if we don't know for sure how she was killed?
I think usually that is very important. It seems like here they did say it was some sort of asphyxiation, but whether or not it was strangulation or whether or not it was something put in her mouth. Because I think when they found her, there was something in her mouth as well as her being bound and then put in the refrigerator. So clearly there was physical, and then there was physical signs of her struggles. There was so much abuse to her body between the bounds and the physical signs of defense, as well as something in her mouth. I don't think a defendant can argue that this was an accident in any means or anything like that. So although usually that wiggle room, let's say, in the cause of death can be crucial in this case, especially because there was something found in her mouth, the way she asphyxiated may not be as much of a loophole, let's say, for the defense as it normally would be.
Notably missing from the autopsy report, any signs of sexual assault.
That was the most unusual part of the autopsy for me, because you would think in a situation like this young, beautiful woman by herself in her apartment, really gruesomely killed, would also be sexually assaulted. We see that a lot when we see violent men against women, there's also often both a sexual and non-sexual violent act against them, especially when they're going to kill the person. So the fact that there wasn't here, I thought was unusual. It could point to the fact that it was a woman and not a man, and possibly the defense will use that argument, although it's kind of a delicate argument for them to try to use. But that, I think, will be harder for the prosecution maybe to prove some sort of motive, because it's easier, I think, to say this was just like some man who was obsessed with her and, wanted to kill her because he spurned her. That kind of argument is a lot harder to make when there wasn't a sexual assault involved.
The autopsy notes that Mooney was last seen with both a man and woman getting on the elevator. Saeed Dahl says that other woman will already be on investigators' radar.
Especially since they did find the man, or they're saying they found the man, then it wouldn't have been that hard, you would think, to connect them to this other woman. And that could be why it took so many months, is because they were trying to track down everybody that they could see on that surveillance footage and interview them. And it's possible a charge might still be brought against that woman. Just because it was brought against the man doesn't mean it won't be brought against the woman. Or we might see some sort of plea deal and have her testify. So this case is just beginning, I would say. This charge against him means that they feel like they have solid evidence against at least one person involved. But we will see more as this case unfolds.
A day after Mooney was last seen, surveillance video captures a man believed to be Humphrey using her key fob to get into the elevator carrying plastic bags. He was alone at the time. For the defense, how do they combat something like this? Is it possible that the defense could also have a strong case?
Yes, and especially with what you said, this other woman. When there's two people in footage like that, that's a classic defense argument. It's not me, it's that person over there. And sometimes they point to an unknown person. It's even better when they can point to a real person. And so their argument might be like, I have nothing to do with it. It's this woman, and the police didn't pay enough attention to her, or a whole bunch of other things. And that can work sometimes, because you're really just trying to it's the reasonable doubt, right? Not that there's no doubt, but reasonable doubt. And you can create it when there's multiple people involved, and if the police haven't done a really thorough investigation. So it's really, we'll have to see what they did with their 6 months and how much they were able to cross off the other suspects in a way that the defense can't poke holes in.
Again, we're still super early in the case, but do you think this is one that will head to trial?
That's a really great question. We never know, but I do think it will, because, again, most likely they have pretty decent evidence against him, because we talked about this, the surveillance footage alone would be pretty decent evidence. And it's possible they found some sort of DNA or fingerprints or whatever. And if that's the case, if they have multiple pieces of evidence, there really isn't an incentive from the prosecution's point of view to give him a plea that would be less than life. And then at that point, there's not much of an incentive for the defense to take that plea, especially in California, where there is a moratorium on the death penalty. Telling a defendant that they won't seek the death penalty doesn't really help them that much, knowing that they probably aren't going to get executed. So I could see this going to trial because of the seriousness and quite frankly, the gruesomeness of the crime. I can see the prosecution not wanting to, give any kind of a meaningful plea to the defendant.
If the case does go to trial and Humphrey is convicted, he could face the death penalty. But Saeed Dahl says it's extremely unlikely that he would actually be executed.
Technically, California still has the death penalty on the books, but we have a moratorium for years where it's essentially paused any death penalty implementation, let's say, of our death penalty. So even if he were sentenced to the death penalty in the state of California, he will not actually face the death penalty. And most likely that's not going to change for the foreseeable future.
That means the most Humphrey could face is life in prison without parole, and the future timetable of his case is really in Humphrey's hands.
it's the defendant that has a constitutional right to a speedy trial. The prosecution doesn't have a right to a speedy trial. So if the defendant really wanted to have this go quickly, they have every right to make this go quickly. But usually it's the opposite. Defendant usually wants to kind of drag this on a little bit because, for one, they can maybe have some of their own investigations. Maybe they can uncover some evidence of flaws, let's say, of how the law enforcement investigated it. They want to try to poke holes in the case themselves. And then the longer it takes, sometimes witnesses themselves move or die or forget things. So we tend to see the defendants themselves try to drag on the case. And depending on what emotions and come up, what arguments they're able to make, we've seen things be dragged on for years. But absent any kind of really unusual circumstances, I would think within a year we would get at least close to a trial here.
Right now, Humphrey is being held without bail. He's due back in court on March 7th for a preliminary hearing in Los Angeles County. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Sierra Gillespie.